Hi, everybody. This is module number 4 for Organizing on the Side of Love, Intersectionality, some history and some practices. So let's get started. History of the term. So this term was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989. Comes out of intersectional theory. So she framed it in a way that engages from an academic frame. So we're going to talk a little bit more about the other origins of some of the ideas and also how they've been put into practice. In Crenshaw's definition, it's the study of overlapping or intersecting social identities and related systems of oppression, domination, and discrimination. So often that's described as the matrix of the way that people are impacted. For example, you're impacted by structural homophobia as a queer person. And if you're a queer Black woman, you're dealing with the intersections of that homophobia with structural white supremacy and racism, with as well as with gender oppression. So a typical example of that, let's think about for an organizer and someone who is starting out. They're dealing with the structural racism of breaking into and learning about organizing when you're a person of color, and how much easier it often is to access those resources when you're white. Are also dealing with the assumptions that are made about organizers who identify as women. For example, that we're more strong on heavily logistical tasks, that we can't be strong frontline leaders. Our ideas aren't taken seriously in the same way. And then dealing with the structural issues of being queer and the kind of assumptions that come when you are both woman and queer and a person of color. Typical stereotypes include that you're bitter, cynical, negative, that you don't work well with others, and that you're not strategic or shouldn't be positioned as a movement architect. So that would be one example in real time of the kind of cultural barriers that you're dealing with. Obviously, there's also an intense amount of structural oppression that people are dealing with at that intersection, from fear of walking down the street to the fact that the majority of folks of color, particularly in Black communities, are dealing with either some economic disparities with white folks, or people that they're close to are dealing with a higher level of poverty, as well as the structural homophobia of being an organizer and not being able to take care of your family in basic ways, often because of policies against you, not being able to go use a bathroom at an organizing gathering because you're trans or gender nonconforming, and you have to be worried every time you go there, right? So just to give us a myriad sense of the ways that these interact in people's everyday life. Now, a couple things about the term before and after definition. We're going to go to the next slide because it has some great visuals about this. So the concepts that come before intersectionality are often attributed to the Combahee River Collective in its 1977 statement, and the lived experiences of Black feminists. So particularly, if you haven't read it, it's worth checking out. The Combahee River is a river in South Carolina that was the name for this collective. The foreword of the original statement is done by Barbara Smith. Many people consider her and Audre Lorde some of the key leaders of Black feminist thinking. And it outlines thinking about the intersections in really critical ways in the practice of the organizing, which is why you see in this slide the subtext is Black feminist organizing in the 70s and 80s. So some of the stuff in the original statement is like, white women, please stop touching our hair as Black women. So very practical, day-to-day feminist organizing articulation of politic. And some of it is naming the lived ways that different kinds of oppression are coming together. Specifically, I use the example of Black queer women or Black lesbian women because that is some of the examples of how these folks were living their real lives and came to their analysis in practice. Matrix of domination is another term that's often used for looking at intersecting forms of oppression. Basically, that's what I was already outlining, that you're looking at all of the ways that systems are colluding with each other to not only sort of structurally create barriers for living lives of safety and dignity, but also cultural barriers that minimize that harm. So you're constantly being told that's actually not real. It's actually, quote, not that bad to be living as a poor person with a disability who's also a person of color in this country. What are you complaining about? Those structural barriers don't exist. And so in the ways that those matrix function, people living at the intersection often have insights into what those oppressions mean when they're colluding together. Now, it's really important to remember that we don't want to romanticize people who are marginalized by oppression. There's not actually a corner on just because you're affected by all these oppressions, you're going to be not only having a really strong politic, but able to do work in a particular way. That's why we often talk about it in terms of lived experience and consciousness, practical application of being able to do the work, and a vision for where we're going. Because we can have lived experience at the intersection and not have much consciousness raising about how our experience connects to history or what kind of practical applications people like us have used for fighting back, right? Or we can have all that stuff and not have vision, and often then be stuck in the, I have a really strong analysis and I'm directly affected, but I don't actually have a vision that's going to create the hunger to go get more skills than the ones I have, go try things out, make mistakes, come back and stay in the work with other people. The 3 eyes of oppression. So this is a concept that is often used when you're training in intersectionality, like 101 political education. And it's often put in a triangle with institutional oppression being at the top, interpersonal on one side, and internalized on the other. And basically what this can help people understand is the nature that these are 3 different ways that oppression impacts folks. So examples of institutional oppression would be like, you go to the hospital and you're not allowed to visit your partner. You have to do 40 hours a week worth of work to get your disability check, right? Because the US government is actually making it so hard to engage the social safety net. You are dealing with educational systems that are teaching your children of color to hate themselves, to not understand actually the legacy of where they're coming from, and to not engage practical applications for how they're going to get the education they need for them to survive in a school system, right? Those would all be institutional. And often when you're doing it in popular education, you actually have people make their own list because they'll be like, it's the school system, it's the legal system, it's all these pieces, and they'll kind of lay out the institutional. So interpersonal, I think one of the best examples that we can think of is the concept of gatekeepers. So gatekeepers is often a term used where someone has structural power. For example, the CEO of a large company who is the white straight man living in Massachusetts in his 50s. And then that person employs gatekeepers to buffer and be the go-between with people who are dealing with working for that company. So that would be like creating middle management that are Spanish-speaking Latino folks who are going to go speak to people who are working in the fields, right? So that you're actually creating a buffer there. And often folks of color are intentionally hired in corporate structures in that buffer role so that there's somebody to go communicate back. It happens all the time with politics as well, right? We've all seen actually pretty conservative right-wing pushers in politics who make sure that they always have one, Black woman who has a particular job in their administration. So they're always pointing to that person. So that's a way that interpersonal oppression is playing out, even by people impacted by similar circumstances in their life. It's not really an issue that is particularly partisan, because across the political spectrum, politicians engage this, across the corporate sector, it's engaged. And also many of us would say that it's used in massive, well-resourced nonprofits to make sure that there's a buffer created by people who are actually really angry and want resources to go to grassroots organizing, and the people who are more institutionalized into big organizations that are receiving a lot of funding to say, oh no, well, we don't actually need people who are living in this community, because don't worry, we have some folks of color, or we have some gay folks, or we have some white feminists from another place that's willing to come in and speak for people in the community. So that would be some of the ways the interpersonal plays out. Internalized oppression, we could do a whole module just on that. But I think it's really important, because people have different lived experiences who are watching this course, to understand that internalized oppression is also something that's very specific to a community. It's not appropriate for people outside that community to be coming in, trying to give people a lot of feedback on their internalized oppression. It's often a private conversation that happens inside communities about how it's playing out. But I think, what I do think I feel comfortable sharing, and is important to share, is some of the ways that we're having conversations about LGBTQ internalized oppression, especially after the Orlando massacre and after Pulse. There's a way that particularly those of us who have some other privileges, who are white, and who maybe are lesbian and gay and are passing as straight all the time, have to really think and look at what we've bottled up around our assumptions about the safety that we have. And some of those assumptions are right, because we're walking around conforming to gender norms and being white, such as myself. And some of them are actually misnomers, where we've been convinced that we're safer than we are, because we've internalized a level of denial about how we're actually living. I think other forms of internalized oppression that I've seen play out in my work are the sort of sense that we actually are not good enough, that there actually is something wrong with us as LGBT people. I think a heavy level of infighting and drama in our community, and sometimes in other marginalized communities, can be a way that internalized oppression plays out. It can be an example of how that manifests inside, and then how it happens between us. So, an example of that would be that it's actually feels safer or more comfortable to be constantly fighting each other than to name how massive the work is in front of us to dismantle structural homophobia, for example. And so we spend a lot of time trying to figure out how to deal with the conflicts that arise when folks are trying to tell each other they're the smartest ones, they're the ones with the best plan, they're the ones with the sharpest analysis, other leaders or other groups aren't any good. It's a manifestation of, some would say, human nature, but also a level of drama that feels safer than having to attack some of our bigger problems, or the vulnerability and power sharing that has to come to actually unite force. One of the simplest and most important things to name about internalized oppression is that it moves like all three of these. You could also put them on a continuum if you were sharing them with people and training them of sort of least severe to most. And so when you're looking at internalized oppression, you're looking at everything from some of the pieces that I just described all the way up to people committing suicide. And I think that happens in more communities than folks look at. Some people commit suicide in a variety of different ways that are covered as suicide, and other people are committing suicide via drugs and alcohol all the time. Suicide by police, which we also know is something that impacts a lot of low-income, working class, and working poor people of color. And I think that's really important to put it on the continuum. Similarly, with institutional oppression, there's everything from sort of daily being monitored by the police to being incarcerated for 30 years of your life in terms of engaging. And interpersonal, again, it can move everything from the spectrum of gatekeepers and how gatekeepers are buffering or impacting our lives, all the way to the way that interpersonal oppression plays out with sexual assault between people in communities, violence against people inside of communities, and how people are playing out the oppression they're experiencing in their lives. We all have agency, but we're also working in very, very different contexts based on where we're coming from. Audre Lorde, again, if you don't know who she is, please Google her. seen as one of the mothers of third wave feminism and intersectional feminism. She was a poet, she was an organizer, she was a theorist and writer. And one of the things that she wrote about a lot is the idea of a mythical norm. So the idea that actually everyone is being set up in this frame next to a mythical norm that doesn't necessarily exist. Some of us look a lot closer to fitting in than others, but many of us, you start to scratch the surface of the life we're living, and it's actually, the edge is a lot closer than we think. Very few people in this country are living the class ascending, sort of wealthy, white, straight, married with 3 kids, suburbs. No one has a disability. No one's dealing with mental health issues. No one has a trans or LGBT child. No one has kids that are affected by racism, or as we know in many of our UU congregations, folks have grandchildren who are kids of color, right? Like all of these kind of different ways that we're being impacted. Very few people are living inside the mythical norm. And that was true in the 80s as well. And it's even more true now, I would argue. And Audre Lorde was talking about it then, to sort of help us also change this idea that the people at the margins are actually the minority, and that we're marginalized and isolated in particular ways. That's a structural assumption based on creating a mythical norm. And then finally, intersectionality as a buzzword. So this is an interesting kind of contemporary concept that a lot of people are debating right now. Intersectionality as an idea and how it comes into practice has gained a lot more traction, both in terms of groups trying out what that looks like on the ground, which we're going to come to in a second, and also talking about the idea. And the idea, many of us wanted the idea to proliferate and cross-pollinate, be out in the world more than it was in the late 90s. At the same time, it creates both opportunity to engage people more deeply in the practice, but it also creates the threat of that idea just becoming meaningless and everyone saying that every piece of work is intersectional, which is why it's really important to understand the history, because there's a lot of organizations and leaders that are sort of engaging the idea of intersectionality as though it's brand new, and it actually comes out of the legacy and body of work of a lot of folks. So intersectionality principles and action. So beyond intersectionality as a buzzword means that we actually have to have a conversation about what are intersectional campaigns, what are some examples, and then what would be some of the principles of how they actually come into our work. So we're going to talk about some specific examples, but I want to start with some of the principles in action, because for those of us at home who've been trying out intersectional work or who want to try it at home, it's really important to understand how the values of understanding intersectional oppression and understanding those connections, and therefore wanting to combat oppression in intersecting ways, plays out in how we do the work. So this is not an exhaustive list, but I wanted to give us some starting places. So one of the ways that we need to understand principles in action is understanding interconnections. So understanding interconnections, I feel like theoretically we went into in a couple of the previous slides. But understanding the interconnections of how, when we're working with people, they are also in real time impacted by different forms of oppression is important. One basic example would be if you're doing organizing and you met someone at an event, they signed up to the list, they're really excited, and you try to get in touch with them and they're not responding to you at the same rate that the majority of the white middle class college students you're working with are responding to your emails, you might want to try to engage them and give a little wait time on how you're building the relationship, especially if you know factors such as they're working 2 jobs. This is a working class person. They have 3 little kids at home. Whenever I'm building a relationship, I try to just observe some of the information that's being given to me about the interconnections of the way that oppression might be playing out in different folks' life. And then as you get to know people, if there's a path to trust and you're building trust, people are going to give you more information. But you can't necessarily, you want to hold everybody organizing to a standard of excellence in the work, but also understand that pace, that background information on the work, that the language you use is all going to be impacted by interconnections of the ways that people are experiencing marginalization and oppression. And I think this is really important when we see a lot of times around class and the way that class colludes with transphobia, with homophobia, with racism, with being undocumented, people are really quick to scrutinize organizations that are primarily led by poor people, which is really complicated because a lot of times the organizations scrutinizing their work are heavily resourced, coming from a very strong understanding of how you get money and move money, how you navigate academic language, etc. And yet, instead of seeing all the structural deficits, not in the quality of the leaders at hand, but at the access that people have, people are really quick to kind of move into judging those groups and holding them to a standard, even though there's a lot of invisible privileges moving around well-resourced organizations that are led by people who come from upper middle class backgrounds. Understanding self-determination. So this is critical. One of the things that I've often said when I've trained organizers, again, who come from an upper middle class background, I'm thinking about this example in some ways, and particularly those folks are white, is that 75% of communication is nonverbal. So when you stand over someone who comes from a working poor background, who's a person of color, and you're sort of finger wagging and thinking you have the perfect answer, most of the time what people are picking up is the whole history they've had their whole lives of white people who come from money standing over them, shaking their finger at them and telling them what to do. You could feel like you have the most brilliant idea in the world, which I would also say it would be really great to question our assumptions about our own ideas as well, and see if we're getting feedback that it's a helpful idea or not. But the approach that you're taking and dictating ideas and strategy is actually going to undermine what you're trying to do. So understanding self-determination means that if you're doing work that is directly led by people who are from that community, and you've said that you want to be part of that, those people are going to be determining the process and the pace of the work. And as you're collaborating more, you can be deepening that connection and understanding of how that work's happening, but that's only one part of it. Continual consciousness building and self-reflection. This one I'm actually not going to go into that much because I think it's pretty simple. You want to be adopting a curious listening stance of humility for reflection on your own practice and building your own consciousness as you go through this work. That doesn't mean you can't bring leadership. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't develop competencies and be aware of them and sure in them, but understanding that people don't owe us anything in this work and they don't necessarily care that much about where we're coming from in the process. They're wondering if we're willing to continue to meet the moment, continue to learn. Listening and believing, again, this is pretty simple. I think it actually comes out of some of the examples of work around people who are survivors of domestic and sexual violence. If you're going to be working with people, you need to be listening to them and believing what they're saying and giving them the benefit of the doubt. If people are engaged in hustle, if there's a lack of sincerity or integrity, you go to that place when you come to it, but you don't come from a place in organizing that you're assuming the worst from people. Beyond equality towards liberation, I think we've covered that some in this course. The idea that equality is going to bring us all to this standard of us all having a piece of the pie as it exists. And liberation is actually saying we need a new pie that involves not just, quote, equal rights and equal protections for marginalized people, but re-engaging the way our systems engage with us, how we're part of those systems, and how we interact with each other. Okay. So we're going to talk a little bit more, because we mentioned consciousness raising, about what consciousness raising is. So this was a term that became popularized in the 1970s via feminist consciousness raising circles, which we could go into a little bit more, but that was a strategy that was about actually women, and in this case it was mostly white middle-class women, but not all, who were self-organizing in their own communities in groups of 6 or 7 to explore what it meant to be a woman, culturally, physically, in a variety of ways in their understanding. And it broke a lot of the isolation that folks were experiencing around gender oppression. Now, that term is used in a lot of different circles. At this point in time, it's used in every social movement in one way or another. It's simply the process of helping to build collective consciousness about what's going on, what has been going on, and it often leads towards where we're going. So there's heavily spiritual connotations to that term, of course. Consciousness raising suggests it's a both and with political education. I often think that one of the central metaphors is, how do you help people who are coming to understand their experience, for example, as a working class person, load their life experience into a river of history around labor organizing, for example, where they see their story as part of a pattern and connected to a whole, even as their individual lives are differently impacted. And usually what you want to do in that process is help people engage the information and then just make sure you don't mess up the spiritual part that happens for people in a really good consciousness raising experience. Popular education is one method of consciousness raising. Again, we're not going to go really far into that here, but there's some really important people who articulated the process of popular education, like Paulo Freire in Brazil, Miles Horton here at the Highlander Center in the US in the 30s. But essentially, popular education is finding ways that people, absolutely irregardless of whether they are quote unquote literate in English or any other language, can engage a process of, we all, again, bring a piece of the pie for what's going on and we leave with the whole pie because we're informing ourselves and each other about our lived realities and our histories. Consciousness raising and some of the modalities that we talked about here are essential for intersectional organizing, because if you don't have consciousness, you can't have an intersectional analysis, which means that you're constantly going to be operating work from a deficit, always one step in front of the other. And you can't really have long game if you don't have an analysis. Okay, intersectional organizing and activism. Let's talk a little bit about what this looks like in real time. So one of the things that has happened with intersectionality being a buzzword has been that there's a lot of discussion about what the theory is, but not enough examples of what the work looks like. So some of the elements of intersectional organizing and activism is having a big frame, but specific goals. So why is this? Intersectionality needs a big frame. It needs a big frame because it's looking at the whole picture of all these different ways that domination is interacting, and therefore resistance needs to understand interacting. But it has to have specific goals. Why? Because if you keep the goals broad, you don't know where to start. You can't pick a campaign. Do you work around the intersection of disability and poverty? Or do you work around the intersection of police and deportations as well as mass incarceration? Like, where do you're going to try to, in so much generalness, be able to work on nothing. So a big frame and then specific goals. So that's what this second slide goes into. It's often misunderstood to mean an organization or movement organizes on everything at once. So again, looking at a theory of change, strategies, tactics, tasks, or actions. So again, let's think a little bit more about what are some of the components, and then I'll name some examples. So most groups doing intersectional organizing focus on issues, opportunities that impact multiple communities, or that have the potential to create wins that can impact multiple communities. Intersectional organizing narrows in focus for particular projects or campaigns, etc., but does not wage campaigns that benefit one specific group of deeply marginalized people at the expense of other deeply marginalized people. Okay, so a couple of examples. Thinking about what is now a large piece of infrastructure around organizing domestic workers. So the National Domestic Workers Alliance and some of the work that came out of that organizing domestic workers was saying, how do we actually make some of the fight around wages and labor more feminist? What constituency can we start to engage and reframe as central protagonists in labor that are actually working class and working poor women of color, LGBTQ and straight, immigrants, and folks who are Black folks who might not identify as immigrants? And what they found was that a lot of people were doing domestic work, right? They were working with people in their homes who were older, They were working with people with disabilities. Folks were working as nannies. And they were like, what if we talk about domestic work as a bigger frame of labor that could bring all those folks together, right? So that if you're of Caribbean ancestry and you're a recent immigrant and you are a nanny being paid very poorly in New York City, how are you connected to folks in Oklahoma who are indigenous, who are working as personal assistants for someone in a wheelchair, right? Well, some of the ways you're connected are usually by class. You're probably not making a bunch of money. And by race. It's mostly folks of color, and by gender. Most of the people doing that work are women. So not only did they build intersectional campaigns, they built an intersectional frame to make an intervention on labor and say, no, labor is not only Rust Belt white men making $100,000 a year in Detroit. It's that, and it's also all these domestic workers, right? So if you're interested in NDWA or domestic worker organizing and the history of that, I would encourage you to Google it. I think it's a really good example. I think it's also a good example of the work that NDWA has done with lots of bumps and issues, etc., to also say, okay, how are we not doing this at the detriment of people with disabilities? How are we continuing to hold that a better wage for people who are working as, PAs for people with disabilities are also part of how we're bringing disability justice into being. So definitely check them out there under the not trying to throw people under the bus and the organizing itself. Other examples of, specific work, I think the Movement for Black Lives and BLM gives us some great examples in their insistence that all Black lives matter, and how incredibly pro-feminist, pro-trans, pro-woman, pro-poor people, pro-undocumented people their work has been. The Dream Defenders in Florida, also really interesting Black-led work that has made a huge commitment to working with young people. And then as their organization progressed, they started to isolate and look at the ways, in their words, that some of the Southern Black organizing actually had a gap around addressing patriarchy and oppression, and saying, okay, wait a minute, we want to do a lot more work to try to free our organization from the sort of gender norms where there's always a particular, Black men in the organization are playing one role, Black women in the organization are playing a different role, and that's the way it has to be. And so they're very, I think, inspirational for a lot of organizations across race who want to have a deeper understanding and interrogation of the way gender roles are playing out and actually reverse the flow on that, make some change. And then I think another great example would be, many people now know the term undocumented and unafraid, coming out of the shadows, coming out of the closet. And some people don't know that that actually originally comes from the Illinois Youth Justice League, who both coined that term and were really filling out this piece around what does it mean to be undocu-queer? What does it mean to be undocumented and queer? And they were experimenting with that frame, and now that frame is everywhere. Many LGBTQ organizations have embraced it, and many pro-LGBTQ, primarily straight and not trans immigrant organizations have embraced it. So those would be some specific examples. I think that overall, this little comic brings us to one of the biggest issues that comes up in an argument for intersectional organizing and activism, which is not that any groups need to wait their turn, but that we see an organizing culture, partially because of nonprofits, that's flooded with different brands, different issues, and people fighting each other for time and saying, this is the most important issue. This is the most important issue. We have to do this now. And it essentially, intersectional organizing and activism give us a way to say, how do we actually make fashion smart campaigns that have a really broad frame and vision and really specific goals about what we're trying to work on and win. Okay. Common mistakes and struggles in intersectional organizing. Again, we're not going to go really deep in this because I think folks know, although we can definitely answer more questions over email or on Facebook. But here's some common stuff that comes up. Intersectionality becomes a meaningless laundry list. We are here fighting for people of color, undocumented people, two-spirit people, folks with this, right? You know where I'm going. Like, people put out the laundry list to make sure that they have themselves covered. But at the end of the day, that doesn't actually mean we're making real impact or progress at the intersection. The second one, I think we've also touched on some. Words change, practice stays the same, base stays the same. Typical example of this is upper middle class, white-led policy organization working on LGBTQ issues. Their donors and their supporters stay the same. And the way that they're interacting with people, the way that they're prioritizing policy work that benefits sort of the most, quote, upper crust of the community stays the same. They hire one Black organizer to do their, quote unquote, intersectional project. That person has no structural power in the institution, but is expected to hold the water on that. And all of a sudden they're applying for grants to do their intersectional work. Cultural incompetencies, this is a way longer conversation than we can have here, but essentially not knowing how to interact with people inside of the intersections of oppression that they're dealing with. So just a literal inability to have the cultural competency to engage the language, tone, and approach with different communities. No home training, quote unquote. This is something I always learned in the South that people would say a lot in the South. When we don't mean offense, but we signal offense. Again, this has a lot to do with a sort of cultural approach and assumptions that people make. I feel like for those of you who are UUs, there were some really specific examples that came up at the General Assembly this year where I think a lot of folks of color were naming some of the places which sometimes start as, quote, ouch moments for engaging different communities. And how are we engaging some of that feedback and input, right? So everything from the assumption that dark-skinned Black youth at gatherings were actually not part of that gathering and need to be wearing a name tag because the assumption was that they must be outsiders, right? Just a real, do people mean offense when they're guarding those doors? Do people mean offense when they're at big supposedly liberal conferences and they're policing the door and trans women are told you can't use that bathroom? No, but we're signaling offense in the inability to see the intersections. Another one is Oppression Olympics. So this is basically the idea that many people take on, that the moment they're living in and the experience they're living are the worst human conditions that any human being has ever experienced, and that the things that they're experiencing need to be at the top of the list for everybody. Now, oppression is real. It intersects in very real ways, and there's some lived experiences we don't have when we're not living that life. I don't walk out into the same world as someone who has been on disability financially and has not been able to find work in 35 years walks into, right? It's just not the same experience. The lived experience of being homeless, the lived experience of being a Black person who is identified as a dark-skinned Black person every single day is a different lived experience, right? But too often what we find is that actually the people who want to play Oppression Olympics the most are often people coming out of much more established institutional space, right? They're often the people coming out of an academic framework who are working on their PhD. They're the people who are coming out of bigger institutions. And it's a real problem with organizing. No long-term goals. This can often happen, again, going back to the laundry list. You're trying to work on everything, so you're having a really hard time figuring out what your specific long-term goal is. And no theory of change. When intersectionality itself becomes the theory of change. Well, my theory of change is we need to dismantle all of the oppression at this intersection. That's not a theory of change. It's not taking a risk to put out what you might have to actually do, what things you might have to try, what kind of strategies you're invested in, how you actually think you can change both the material conditions and cultural conditions. Okay. So let's wrap this up a little bit with an example of how you can have a big frame. I think some of you also are probably at home or at work or wherever you're hanging out in the coffee shop thinking, okay, great, Caitlin, great. Big intersectional frame, specific goals. Well, what is a big intersectional frame? So I wanted to offer this frame that comes from some work that was happening in the mid-2000s between a set of organizations, Disability Justice Collective, Two-Spirit First Nations Collective, Fierce, Southerners Underground, the Audre Lorde Project, sure I'm missing someone now that I'm saying it all to you all. A set of organizations that were working together, Queers for Economic Justice, which no longer exists. That was the other organization. And the people in this room were working together to try to build a stronger LGBTQ frame for the movement. And the frame that we worked on, we called it Access, Sovereignty, and Liberation. And it was very interesting to us because it was a lot of disability justice activists who had not literally had access because of disability to some of these intersectional conversations. And Indigenous, First Nation, Two-Spirit folks who were bringing a lot of knowledge around a sovereignty framework. And what does it mean to think about individual self-determination for people and collective sovereignty for people, a tribe, a nation, a constituency. And then the liberation framework that comes out of a lot of different work. Like, for example, we were using was the LGBTQ liberation framework. People are saying we want more than just equality. We're not here to assimilate and be like straight people. We want to be able to exist on our own terms. So what are the pluses of some of this was we were able to interrogate the ways we had a lot to learn about what radical access means for people to be able to engage, what radical sovereignty means to be able to have collective self-determination, and what liberation actually looks like in a conceptual framework. What are some of the pluses of this? Radically widening the who around access. So that means that how are we thinking about a framework for our work that, as one of my comrades, Eli Claire, used to say, actually engages and thinks about the people with significant disabilities who are in the back rooms, living in the back rooms of their families' houses, in small towns and big cities and communities all around this country, being treated like children and buffered from an opportunity to engage in movement. How are we thinking about those folks in what we're doing in a way that I knew up till that point in my life I hadn't been thinking about. I wasn't affected in that same way. How are we also engaging on the border of sovereignty? I think I named that a little bit. Where's the community? Where it's not just about what do I feel like doing? Like, self-determination in a sovereign frame doesn't mean I'm like, I'm picking what I have for lunch and I have gas in my car to go get it. Therefore, boom, I'm a queer person. Now we're self-determined, right? But it's actually broader than that. And then liberation, I think, is the spiritual and aspirational visionary idea that we could have free bodies, minds, and spirits, right? That weren't being encumbered, attacked, and destroyed by the kind of spiritual warfare on marginalized communities. Telling us that, as we've heard recently, that more people should have died in the Orlando attack, right? That we don't actually deserve to live as LGBTQ people, and that particularly LGBTQ people of color in that example don't deserve that we actually have to turn on the TV and hear that all the time. And how we're engaging our minds, our own conception of what is beautiful, what is powerful, what is effective and meaningful, what are the ways that we can think about the possibilities for our lives that are not boundaried in by that work. And then free bodies, what does it mean to be free from fear? What does it mean to feel that we can walk in the world and not be worried that we're going to die for being who we are that day, right? That we are not going to have our reproductive abilities and choices taken from us because we are women, those of us who are women of color, right? Who have endured forced sterilization. That would be one example. That we don't have to be understanding that we're getting sicker and sicker, but not have access to go to a doctor and know that if we go, our experience of transphobia might be so humiliating that we would literally rather stay home and die at home. And I think a lot of times people who have not been intimately connected to some of the struggles that people are going through, they think that's not real. That can't be real. There can't really be transgender people who would rather stay home and die of ovarian cancer than go and be humiliated and tormented in hospitals. It's real. It happens all the time, right? Sterilization, that's not really real. Yes. Oh, well, if that happened, it must have happened several hundred years ago. No. We're talking about, class action litigation suits for sterilization that happened in parts of the U.S. South as recently as in the past 20 and 30 years, right? Let alone, we're not even talking about the ways that people with disability endure forced sterilization and decisions against their will. So these kinds of frames, how are we creating frameworks that widen out the space of how we're engaging our work? This is one example. There's a lot of other examples, but there's a good set of people walking around who were politicized out of this out of this frame in the LGBTQ movement. Finally, spiritual dimensions of intersectional organizing. Again, this is nebulous. I know that for some folks, we've had some feedback about this course that when we talk about spirituality, it's very nebulous and broad. So why? Reason for that? Well, it's a really broad thing to talk about in a way that doesn't become specific into some people's religious beliefs or kind of their frame. And we want to talk about it much more widely. And the spiritual components that we see of that are the place where our spirit, the spirit that we all have, meets the practice and the work and the political. And also, I think a good question to engage around the spiritual aspects of the work are, where are the places where the work becomes more than just what it is? More than the sum of 2 + 2 is 4. Where does it expand into alchemy? Where does it expand into transformation? Where people experience both mental and spiritual transformation in terms of their political lives, in terms of their practices, which is really, I mean, that's what we're always engaging with, questions of spirituality. So asking ourselves, where are some of the places where intersectional organizing can take us deeper, can take the work deeper, can help us go there more? Where are the opportunities where the work actually can open us up if we give it a chance to do that? So embracing complexity and multiplicity. I think intersectional organizing requires us to embrace that complexity and multiplicity. It's not just about our experience. It's not just about one experience. It's not just about a checklist of what we need to do, boom, 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 and then the work is done. In the messiness and the multiplicity, the hybridity of the methods, the hybridity of the moments, we're actually able to push that rigidity a little bit that many of us have in different ways based on our experience. Sometimes it's culturally different. Some of us struggle more than others. How are we able to push that open? Embracing nuance, very similar, right? Is it the right answer? Is it the wrong answer? Is it the best strategy for all time? We're always going to do this strategy. It's all going to come out in an arc? No, not necessarily. Embracing nuance means sometimes no move is a move. And sometimes your move needs to be very, very assertive. Embracing nuance means we're actually engaging how it can be a both and, right? Standing on the side of love can be a great frame from our work. And also for people with disabilities, it's actively hurting and bringing up harm every single day. How can it be both? How are we holding both, right? By saying standing. So every time we say standing on the side of love, for folks who do not stand, that's not something that they do in their lives, either because they're in a wheelchair or other reasons, actually can't engage that frame, right? And it's been a motivational frame for thousands and thousands of people. It's a banner that people feel like they live their faith. How do we engage that both and? Only a nuanced politic can engage that. Only a spiritually mature position towards our lives can engage that we hold it both at the same time. It is in active conflict. It's in active conflict. Embracing messiness. Again, mess is a little different than nuance. It's a little bit different than living in the contradiction. Embracing messiness means the plan didn't go like you thought it should. Let's say something about organizing. There is no plan that went like we thought it should have. Montgomery bus boycotts didn't go like people thought they should. Gandhi's Salt March didn't go, right, as planned. There is no, organizing is a lived sport. It's a contact sport. It's in the nuance and the engagement with each other, which means it's always a mess. People have a hard time dealing with each other. Something always goes late. Something always falls apart. So if you or any of us are looking for life's work that is not going to be messy, this is not for you. It's not, because it's messy. It's messy. It's always going to be messy, every part of it. And I've many times wish someone had said that to me that directly, right? Messiness is part of life, and it gives us this huge opportunity to let go of the control and the plan that we have for everything, and to live into the moment, do the best we can, work with excellence, and keep it moving. Low ego, high impact. I am so grateful that this concept has gotten a much wider audience, especially in people involved in the movement for Black lives. I think it's so great to see it. So how are we asking ourselves all the time? How do I lower my ego and make my impact higher? So that's a really important question in any part of our work. beyond being experts or beyond being just right? It doesn't matter that much if we're right on whether item 3 or 4 should lead in the agenda or item 6 or 7 if the meeting falls apart and nobody wants to work with us anymore. It doesn't matter that much, the sequence. Sometimes it really matters. Sometimes it really matters, and we should push hard if we have the relationship and we've been in the work. But so many things fall apart because people reach a level of rigidity. A perfect example of this is there's so many national organizations that have spent hundreds and thousands of dollars of creating a perfect cookie cutter campaign to load into the South, for example, right? Well, the South doesn't like that. Southern organizations don't like that. There has to be a relationship and trust before they're ready to have folks parachute in their ideas of cookie cutter, here's the plan, right? In the effort to do good research and bring about the expertise for the next perfect thing to save the South. Most of the national organizations now are hitting a wall. People don't really even want to open the doors or work with them. And then finally, and I think this is somewhat in repetition with earlier work, the lifelong consciousness raising in practice, just to bring that back in, that's a spiritual practice, right? When we talk to people who are, the people in communities who someone says, that's a spiritual person. That's who I go to for spiritual care. That's my spiritual leader. When you ask those people, what do they do with their lives? Almost all the time, right? I'm sure you all notice this as well. They say, it's a practice. I keep learning. I keep trying. I keep engaging it. I keep practicing it. That's the part that has really specific meaning, I think, around the spiritual implications of this work. Okay. Well, there's a lot of content, and appreciate you all being part of this. And hope it's of use.